Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. We're going to look at critical pathway analysis. It's the last section of 3.3. All I ask for is you subscribe and like and share with your friends. So critical pathway analysis identifies the most efficient way of completing a project, and it's designed by having the activities identified and put in order. The duration of each task needs to be identified, and then tasks are arranged in a network from start to finish, which I'll show you in a second. Take to note, a critical path, these are tasks that have to be done one after the other with no gaps in between. Before we also move on, you need to know what a node is. It's that circle there, now I'll break it down to you. They show where one activity stops and where one starts. So as you can see, you have a big number on the left, number 4. That's just the number of the node or activity. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. That's just the number of the activity. Your top right is something called the earliest start time, which we'll go into next slide, and bottom right is the latest finishing time. We're going to go into those in more detail on the next slide, so don't worry. And just to let you know, if the EST equals the LFT, that means the node is on a critical path. This topic is quite heavy with information, so just from here, know what a critical path analysis is, know what a critical path is, and know the features of a node from this slide. But let's move on to the next one now. Okay, so we have a few definitions you need to know about. Just from the start, I'll say the ones with the red dots are important that you need to know, like you should know off by heart. And the other two are just there as a little bit of extra information that, to be honest, you don't really need to know. But we'll go through them now. So the earliest start time. This is the earliest time since the start of a project that an activity could start. The first EST, which will be in the first node, is always 0. And how you calculate the EST, you add the duration of the previous task to its EST. I'm going to show you an example in the next slide. Then you've got the earliest finishing time. This one you don't really need to know, but I'll just go through it quickly. It's the time an activity will be finished if it started at the earliest start time. And it can be worked out by adding task duration to its EST, and you'll find that in the node. Latest finishing time is another important one you need to know now. It's the latest time an activity can finish without delaying the project. You calculate this by working backwards from the last node. So the latest finishing time equals the earliest start time of the final node, and you start there. And to work out the latest finishing time, you subtract the duration of the next activity from the LFT. Again, I'll show you in the next slide. And now you've got your latest start time, which you don't really need, but it's just it's the latest time an activity can be started and still be finished by its LFT. To calculate the LST, you subtract the duration of the activity from the LFT. The last one you do need to know, the float time. This is very important. It's the length of a time you can delay an activity without delaying the whole completion of the project. So in simple terms, what that's trying to say is, how long can I stop doing this activity without affecting the overall project? And to calculate, you get the LFT and you minus the duration, and then you minus the earliest start time. It's a lot to remember. This is one of the hardest topics in the whole business A-level course. But like I said, if I'm being honest, just remember the ones with the 3 red dots. You don't need to remember the rest. Before we move on to the next slide, I will say, for the earliest start time, you start from the beginning and work your way towards the end. For the latest finishing time, you work from the end and work your way backwards. But we'll go into that now into the next slide, and I'll break it down. Now this is going to be a bit tricky and a bit confusing, but I'll try to go slowly and break it down as simple as I can. Generally speaking, this is an example of a critical path analysis with the nodes here. You may be asked to draw one in the exam, but if you do, it will be maximum 4 marks. But to be honest, it's been very unlikely. Like the recent years, it's hardly been asked to draw. You may just have to use some data from a critical path analysis and use it in your answers. That's the most likely thing. But anyways, we'll talk through slowly from what we're actually looking at. So as it says, it's an example. And there's 9 nodes, which means there's 9 tasks to actually complete, go from A to I. A is the first task, I is the last task. So as you can see, it's task A takes 4 days to complete, and it starts at the same time as G, so they could be done together. Then now if we're looking at task B, that takes 7 days, and task C takes 9 days, and they could be done at the same time once A is completed. And that's why you see the line is purplish pink is the critical path, so they have to be done first before you can do another. Hence why task A is a critical path and a critical activity. It has to be done first before task B and C can actually start. Now moving on, you have task D, and that takes 6 days. And just to let you know, the duration is always written like under the task D, on the little line. That's where you always find the duration of a task. And that can be started once task B is finished. And now you have task E, and task E can start once task B and C have both finished. They both have to be done before you can actually move on to that one. Although it can also be done at the same time as task D. And once task D and E finish, then you can move on to task F. And then task H can start once task G is done. Because remember, you still have that one at the bottom of the critical path analysis. And then finally, task I can start once task F and H have been completed. Now that's a lot to take in, but generally speaking for the exam, there's a bit of a cheat way of getting through this. You don't really need to remember all the ins and outs. What you can do, you just start off by drawing your first node, and as you can see here, it says you can work out the EST of all the tasks by working forwards from the start of the project, and you keep on adding it on. So let's start again from the beginning. 0, 0, as it always starts like that. So for task A, 4 days, you add that on to get your EST and your LFT. And then again, going to task B and to task C, you add on the duration. So if you look at node 4, you see it adds 4 plus 7 to get 11. And then for task C, and that's node 5 now, 4 plus 9 is 13. And now when you go from task D and task E, both end up at node 6. And if you've noticed already, you'll realize that you can't really add both of them. You're only going to get one value. So what you do for the EST, you always take the largest value. As you can see, 11 plus 6 is 17, but 5 plus 13 is 18, and it took the largest value. The earliest start time is always the largest value, whereas the latest finishing time, when you're coming backwards now, is always the shortest value. Hopefully that makes sense. It is a tricky subject, so you might have to watch this a few times to really get it. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments and I will help. But one thing I will say is this topic doesn't come up as much, so don't worry if it's not your best of topics. But anyways, now, as you can see, the critical path is task A, then C, then task E, task F, and finally I. And in each node on the critical path, if you notice, the EST is the same as the LFT. And for nodes that aren't on the critical path, the EST and LFT are different. And now referring to the float time, task B and task D, they have a total float time of 1 day, and task G and task H have a float time of 9 days. These tasks are non-critical activities, so if there is a delay, you can still complete the project on time. And lastly, it talks about a dummy activity between node 4 and 5, but honestly, you won't really need this. The dummy activity, ignore that section, it won't come up in your exams. But before this video ends, we'll look at some pros and cons. Now, the pros is that a business can see what resources are available. Firms can identify tasks with float times and transfer those resources from there to critical activities. Also, it helps with decision making. Managers are less likely to make inaccurate decisions, and it helps firms forecast their cash flow. However, critical path analysis relies on an estimate of how long each task will take. It sets deadlines, so workers may rush tasks to meet deadlines, which can lead to poor quality work. It also doesn't tell you about the cost of a project, and it doesn't take into account factors that may delay the project. From this slide, in all honesty, remember 2 or 3 pros and cons, and for the critical path analysis, just have an idea of how it looks and how to work out the EST and the LFT, because you're very unlikely to be asked to draw one of those, and if you do have to draw one of those, it will be maximum 4 marks. But just remember, this is the most important part I'm going to say, so listen carefully. Start with your first node, where you draw 1 and 0, 0 as the earliest start time and latest finishing time. Then just calculate the earliest start time for each of them first by adding it on. Keep on adding it on. Remember, go back to the previous slide and it tells you have to add on the duration. And once you do that, you'll get to the final node. Then you can work back for the latest finishing time. Thank you for watching. All I ask for is a subscribe and like, and as I usually say, I just get to the point and give you the information you need.